Daniel kept one hand flat on the kitchen table while I went through the papers, not touching them, just keeping his hand there, like they still belonged to him somehow. The dishwasher hummed behind us. It was after midnight. The sink smelled faintly like lemon detergent because he'd run it before I got home. He always cleaned when he thought he might need to look reasonable later. I remember that. "You went through my files?" he asked. Not angry, worse than angry. Tired. I looked down at the mortgage statement again. The address was in Oak Park, small townhouse, 2-bedroom. I knew that street. Not because of him. Because I'd driven past it twice a week going to my second job. "You bought her a house," I said. He rubbed his thumb against the table edge. "It's not exactly. With my grandmother's money." He looked at me then, finally. And there it was. That tiny expression people get when they've been caught doing something for so long that they stopped believing it was wrong. "You never even noticed," he said. The refrigerator motor clicked on behind us. I actually remember that sound more than his voice. I sat there for another second, maybe 2. Then I opened the last envelope. After that, I couldn't hear the dishwasher anymore. A few years earlier, before any of this made sense, people used to tell me how lucky I was that Daniel stayed home. Mostly women said it. Usually tired women. Women carrying grocery bags or wiping a child's face during conversation. "Oh my God, keep him," they'd joke. "Does he teach classes?" Or, "A man who cooks. You better not let anybody steal him." Daniel always laughed politely when people said things like that. He had a good public laugh. Warm, not too loud. Then he'd put a hand on my back, like we were one of those couples in medication commercials. Back then, I worked at a medical billing office downtown during the day and did bookkeeping 3 nights a week for a family-owned hardware store in Berwyn. I kept telling myself it was temporary. That word can ruin your life if you stretch it long enough. Temporary. Daniel had freelanced before we got married. Graphic design mostly, website branding, small contracts. Then the work slowed down, then disappeared. At first he was embarrassed about it. I miss that version of him now, the embarrassed one. He used to apologize when I picked up extra shifts. "I'll figure something out," he'd say. And I believed him because he sounded ashamed. Later he stopped sounding ashamed. That happened slowly. The first year he handled more around the apartment. Laundry, groceries, dinner sometimes. By year 3 people acted like he deserved an award for loading a dishwasher. Meanwhile, I had learned how to sleep sitting upright on the train. One Friday in September, my manager asked if I could stay late to fix insurance coding errors before quarterly audits. I texted Daniel around 6. "Running late again, sorry." He replied almost immediately, "No worries, we're at Jenna and Rob's already." I stared at the message while someone in the office microwave burned popcorn. I had forgotten about the cookout. Not completely forgotten. More like, pushed it somewhere else in my brain because there wasn't room for everything anymore. I got there close to 8:30. Still wearing office clothes. Hair pinned up badly. My shoulder hurt from carrying my laptop bag all week. Jenna opened the door holding a margarita glass. "There she is," she said. "Too cheerful." Music was playing in the backyard. Someone had hung string lights over the fence. Daniel stood near the grill, talking to 2 men from Rob's office. He looked relaxed. Comfortable. Like he'd been there for hours. When he saw me, he smiled and lifted his beer slightly in my direction. Not enough to walk over, though. I remember that too. I went into the kitchen first, because I suddenly felt ridiculous standing there empty-handed. Jenna followed me. "You work too hard," she said quietly while opening the fridge. I nodded like people do when they don't have enough energy left for honesty. Outside, someone laughed loudly. Then Rob said Claire's basically the husband in this marriage. A few people laughed. Not cruelly. That was the problem. Daniel laughed too. I stood in the kitchen doorway holding a paper plate nobody had handed me. He looked over eventually and saw my face. Then he smiled tighter. Like I was making things difficult. Later that night while we were driving home, he kept one hand on the wheel and sighed. "You know they were complimenting you." I looked out the passenger window. Streetlights moved across the glass every few seconds. I know. You always do this. Do what? Make normal comments feel loaded. I didn't answer. At a red light, he tapped the steering wheel twice. You think I like depending on you. That's not what I said. But that's what you think. The light turned green. He drove another few blocks before speaking again. You know what your problem is. I waited. You don't notice things until they become emergencies. He said it casually. Like advice. When we got home, I reheated leftover pasta in the microwave while Daniel showered upstairs. The apartment was quiet, except for the microwave plate turning. I opened the fridge for water and saw a yellow sticky note stuck beside the milk. Don't forget oat milk. His handwriting. I stared at it longer than made sense. Then I peeled it off and rolled it into a little ball between my fingers. Upstairs, water ran through the pipes. I suddenly realized I couldn't remember the last conversation we'd had that wasn't about money schedules, groceries, or whether the internet bill got paid. I leaned against the counter and tried to think of one. Nothing came. Then I heard Daniel moving around upstairs, and I straightened automatically. Like I'd been caught doing something wrong. I found the first missing bank statement, because Daniel forgot to empty the mailbox before it rained. That was it. No dramatic moment. No lipstick on a collar. Just damp envelopes curling at the edges on top of the radiator while I kicked off my shoes after work. He was making soup when I walked in. Tomato. Too much garlic. You're home early, he said. It was almost 7:30. I touched the envelopes absently while he talked about some podcast he'd listened to. One of those finance shows where men explain discipline into microphones. Most of the mail was junk. Grocery coupons. A credit card offer. Then I saw the bank logo. Our joint account. I almost tossed it aside with the rest, but the envelope had already split open from the rain. Daniel turned around too fast when he noticed it in my hand. Those are old statements, he said. I looked at him. I switched everything to paperless months ago. Oh. He wiped his hands on a dish towel. I forgot. I remember thinking that was strange because Daniel forgot almost nothing. Birthdays, passwords, expiration dates, which cabinet held extra batteries. He remembered everything that mattered to him. I opened the statement right there beside the stove. There were 3 transfers I didn't recognize. Not huge amounts, a few hundred here, 800 there. The kind of numbers you ignore when you're exhausted. What's Greenbridge Holdings, I asked. Daniel reached for the ladle again. Investment thing. What investment thing? I told you about it. He said it automatically, smooth. Like the conversation had already happened, and I was failing to remember it correctly. I looked back down at the paper. You didn't tell me you were moving money. It's not moving money, Claire. Okay, then what is it? He gave a small sigh. Patient. God, he was patient by then. It's basically a holding account while I organize some freelance tax stuff. Why wouldn't you just say that? I literally just did. I didn't answer. The soup simmered quietly between us. After a second he smiled a little and touched my wrist. You're tired. There are sentences that sound caring until you hear them enough times. A month later, my grandmother's probate check cleared. Just under $80,000. Not life-changing money. Chicago isn't kind enough for that, but enough to breathe differently for a while. Enough that I sat in my car outside the bank afterward and cried before driving to work. My grandmother raised 3 kids alone after my grandfather died. She ironed church clothes for neighbors when she needed grocery money. Nothing in her apartment ever matched. She kept cash folded inside old aspirin tins because banks made her nervous. The idea that she left me anything at all still felt impossible. That night, Daniel opened a bottle of wine we'd been saving since our anniversary. To less stress, he said. I remember laughing at that. Not because it was funny, because I wanted it to be true so badly. We sat on the couch, eating takeout noodles from the cartons. For a little while, things almost felt normal again. Daniel had his feet on the coffee table. I was half asleep against his shoulder. Then he said casually, we should probably move the inheritance into the joint account. I lifted my head slightly. Why? So bills are easier. It's already in my savings. Exactly. He smiled. Which you never look at. I stared at the TV for a second. It was some home renovation show. White kitchens, loud couples pretending to argue about backsplash tiles. I don't know, I said quietly. Daniel nodded once like he expected that answer. Then he stood up and carried both our containers to the kitchen sink. You know, he said from the other room, married people usually trust each other financially. Not angry. Just disappointed enough to make me feel selfish. The next morning I transferred the money. I told myself that's what marriage was. Not keeping score. A few weeks after that, I came home early with a migraine. The apartment was quiet, except for music playing softly upstairs. Female singer. Slow acoustic thing. I dropped my bag beside the couch and went into the kitchen for water. There was a wine glass in the sink. Lipstick on the rim. Coral-colored. I stared at it for maybe 5 seconds before Daniel came downstairs. He stopped halfway when he saw me. You're home. I have a migraine. He looked relieved for half a second. Then careful. Oh, okay. I pointed at the glass. Who was here? He glanced toward the sink. Jenna stopped by earlier. Something about the answer landed wrong immediately. Not the words, the speed. She wears coral lipstick now. He frowned slightly. What? Nothing. I opened the freezer for an ice pack. Daniel stayed standing there. She dropped off those folding chairs from July. In October. He crossed his arms. You think I'm cheating on you because there's a wine glass? I almost said no automatically. That's the scary part. Instead, I pressed the ice pack against my forehead and looked at him. No, I said slowly. I think you rehearsed that answer before you walked downstairs. His expression changed for 1 second. Just one. Then he laughed softly through his nose. You really need sleep. That night, he rubbed my shoulders in bed while I lay facing the wall. His hands moved carefully. Familiar. You know I love you, right? He asked quietly. I closed my eyes. Why'd you say it like that? Like what? Like you're checking. He stopped moving for a second. Then started again. You always think something means something else. I didn't answer. Around 2 in the morning I woke up thirsty. Daniel was beside me asleep on his stomach, one arm hanging off the mattress. His phone lit up briefly on the nightstand. Just a notification. No sound. I looked at the screen before it dimmed again. Can't stop thinking about tonight. No name attached. Just the number. I sat there in the dark a while listening to him breathe. Then I picked up the phone carefully. But it was locked now. And suddenly I realized something small. I didn't know his password anymore. By December, Daniel had started hosting people at the apartment without really asking me first. Not huge parties. Just little dinners. Wine nights. Couples from the neighborhood. Friends of friends. People who said things like, "This place feels so warm," while I stood there still wearing my coat from outside. Daniel was good at those nights. He moved easily through rooms, refilled glasses before anyone asked, remembered details about people's jobs and siblings and vacations. I used to think that meant he was thoughtful. Later, I realized he just paid attention when something benefited him. The Thursday, it happened. I'd been at the office since 7 in the morning because the hospital network switched billing systems and everything was breaking at once. By 6, my eyes hurt from staring at coding screens all day. At 8:30, I was still at the hardware store fixing inventory invoices when Daniel texted, "Don't forget tonight." I stared at the message. Tonight. Then another text came. Dinner. People are here already. No question mark, no apology. I closed my eyes for a second. My manager at the store, Luis, looked over from behind the counter. You okay? Yeah. You don't look okay. I forced a smile and kept typing numbers into the register system. By the time I got home, it was after 10. I could hear voices from the hallway outside our apartment. Laughter. Someone dropped something in the kitchen, and everybody reacted at once. When I opened the door, Daniel looked up immediately from the dining table. There were 6 people there. Candles lit. Music low. Empty wine bottles already on the counter. The room smelled like rosemary and butter. For one stupid second I actually thought maybe I'd gotten the date wrong. Like maybe he had told me, and I forgot. That was happening more often by then. Daniel smiled. There she is. Everybody turned toward me at once. I hated that. I stood there holding my laptop bag against my side. Still in work clothes. One heel wet from slush outside. You made it, Daniel said. Made it. Like I'd almost missed my own life. One of the women at the table smiled sympathetically. Long day. I nodded. Daniel stood and crossed the room to kiss my cheek. You okay? He asked quietly. But not quietly enough. I could feel people listening. Yeah. You sure? I looked at him. There's a specific kind of performance some people do when they want credit for caring. That look was all over his face. I'm fine, I said. He squeezed my shoulder lightly before turning back toward the table. Claire works so much, she barely remembers what house she lives in. Everyone laughed politely. Not hard. Just enough. I stood there smiling because not smiling would have been worse. Then I noticed her. The woman sitting closest to the kitchen. Dark green sweater, gold hoops, hair tucked neatly behind one ear. Pretty in a careful way. Not flashy. She looked up at me and smiled like we'd met before. And maybe we had. Chicago's like that sometimes. Then she said, Your husband's been cooking all day. You're spoiled. Your husband. Something about the way she said it. Too comfortable. I took my coat off slowly. Daniel moved beside her while opening another bottle of wine. Their shoulders almost brushed automatically. Like people used to standing close. Nobody else would have noticed it. That's the kind of thing that makes you feel insane later. Dinner blurred after that. I remember pieces. Someone talking about mortgage rates. Daniel interrupting me twice while I tried answering a question about work. The woman in green getting up without asking and finding extra napkins in the drawer beside the stove. That drawer had always jammed slightly unless you lifted it first. She lifted it first. I watched her do it. Then I looked at Daniel. He didn't look back. At one point, she laughed at something he said and touched his arm briefly. Tiny movement. Normal movement. Still, my stomach tightened so suddenly I lost my appetite. Daniel noticed eventually. You barely touched your food. I ate earlier. No, you didn't. He smiled while saying it. Like we were teasing each other. The woman in green glanced between us and looked down at her wine glass. Nobody spoke for a second. Then someone changed the subject too quickly. That silence sat at the table the rest of the night. After dessert, I started clearing plates automatically. The woman in green stood beside me at the sink. Where do you keep the plastic containers? She asked. I looked at her. She smiled politely. I opened a cabinet without answering. Thanks, she said softly. Her nails were painted coral. Not bright. Muted coral. The exact shade from the wine glass. My hands suddenly felt cold under the dishwater. In the living room, Daniel was telling a story loudly enough for everyone to hear. People liked him loud. He knew that. When the guests finally left, the apartment went quiet almost instantly. Daniel locked the door and loosened his collar. Well, he said, I kept rinsing plates. Well, what? You were weird tonight. I dried my hands carefully before turning around. I was working. That's not what I mean. You embarrassed me. He laughed once under his breath. In front of who these people barely know us. You made me sound insane. I made a joke. You kept doing it. His face changed slightly then. More annoyed than defensive. Claire people were uncomfortable. I stared at him. Why? Because you sat there glaring at everybody all night. I wasn't glaring. You barely spoke. I opened the dishwasher harder than necessary. A plate rattled loudly inside. Daniel leaned against the counter watching me. Then he said it casually. You always think people are against you when they're not. I looked down at the silverware tray because suddenly I knew if I looked directly at him, I'd cry. And I did not want to cry in front of him anymore. Not after he started watching me do it instead of helping. A few minutes later, he went upstairs without another word. I stayed in the kitchen cleaning. One wine glass sat near the sink with a faint coral lipstick mark near the rim. I washed it once. Then again. Then a third time. Around midnight, I carried the trash bag outside to the alley dumpster. It was snowing lightly. Not sticking yet. I dropped the bag in, but something slid loose near the bottom. A receipt. Long, folded. Furniture store in Oakbrook. Dining table, bar stools, sofa delivery. Different address. I read the street name twice under the alley light. Then a car passed nearby, and I folded the receipt into my pocket before I even understood why. I didn't confront him right away. That's the part people never understand later. They think betrayal creates instant clarity. It doesn't. Sometimes it just makes you quieter. For almost 2 weeks I carried that furniture receipt in my wallet behind my debit card. I'd forget about it during the day, then remember suddenly while standing in line somewhere. Pharmacy, gas station, grocery store, Oak Park. The address stayed in my head like a song lyric. Meanwhile, Daniel acted normal. More than normal, actually. He started touching me more around other people. Small things. Hand at my back. Kissing my forehead while I answered work emails. One night, he brought flowers home for no reason. Tulips. I remember staring at them in the sink while he trimmed the stems. "You okay?" he asked. "Yeah. You seem distant lately." I almost laughed. Instead, I opened the fridge and moved things around that didn't need moving. The worst part was how badly I still wanted him to explain it away. Not the affair. The lying. I could have survived the affair easier than the lying. A few days before Christmas, I left work early because the office heating system broke and half the staff got sent home. I didn't text Daniel. I almost always texted first. That day I didn't. The apartment was quiet when I walked in. No music, no TV. Just the dryer running upstairs. I stood there taking my gloves off slowly. Then I noticed Daniel's laptop sitting open on the dining table. He usually kept it upstairs by then. The screen had gone dark, but the charging cord was plugged in. I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I touched the trackpad. The screen lit immediately. A spreadsheet was open. Columns of payments. Dates. Transfer amounts. At first I thought it was freelance work. Then I saw my grandmother's name listed in the notes section beside one of the accounts. Something in my chest dropped. I sat down slowly. The spreadsheet connected 3 accounts I recognized, and one LLC account under the name Greenbridge Holdings. The same name from the bank statement. There were monthly transfers going back almost 18 months. Some small. Some not. I opened another file. Mortgage payment confirmations. Oak Park. My mouth actually went dry. I remember swallowing twice and still feeling nothing. Then I heard the dryer stop upstairs. I closed the laptop immediately. Too fast. My hand shook hard enough that I hit the edge of the wine glass beside it. The glass tipped and rolled, but didn't break. Footsteps upstairs. I stood up so quickly my chair scraped loudly against the floor. Daniel called from the hallway above me. "Claire." "Yeah." "You home?" I looked at the laptop. Then at the staircase. "Yeah." He came downstairs carrying folded towels. Completely normal. Gray sweatpants. Old college t-shirt. Reading glasses still on. Domestic. That's what kills me now. How domestic he looked. "Oh," he said, "you're early." I nodded once. His eyes flicked briefly toward the laptop. Not panic. Calculation. "You okay?" "Fine." He set the towels down carefully on the couch arm. "You look pale." "I'm tired." He watched me another second. Then smiled lightly. "Want tea?" I said yes. I still said yes. While he boiled water, I stood in the bathroom staring at myself in the mirror. I kept trying to arrange the information into something less terrible. Maybe investment property. Maybe he was helping someone temporarily. Maybe. I stopped. Because deep down, I already knew. Women know long before they admit knowing. That night, I waited until he fell asleep before taking his phone downstairs. My hands were sweating so badly I nearly dropped it. I tried his old passwords first. Nothing. Then our anniversary. Nothing. Finally, I typed the name of his childhood dog. Unlocked. I sat there in the dark living room, while the Christmas lights blinked softly from the window. There weren't hundreds of messages. That almost made it worse. No dramatic secret life. Just familiarity. Photos of meals. Inside jokes. Complaints about me disguised as concern. She worries me sometimes. I don't think she notices how checked out she's become. Another message. I hate asking her for money now. She gets tense immediately. And her response. Then stop asking. You deserve better than survival mode. I stared at that sentence a long time. You deserve better. At 2:14 a.m., I found the message with the townhouse address. Then the mortgage portal login. Then PDFs. Insurance documents. Utility accounts. Furniture invoices. All connected. Paid through Greenbridge Holdings. I don't remember going upstairs afterward. I only remember morning. Daniel stood in the kitchen making coffee, while I sat at the table with stacks of printed documents spread in front of me. The printer toner was low. Some pages came out streaked. Outside, snow moved sideways across the windows. Daniel didn't speak immediately. Neither did I. He looked at the papers. Then at me. Then he slowly set his coffee mug down. You went through my phone. Not a question. I slid the mortgage statement across the table. You bought her a house. He rubbed his jaw once. It's complicated. No, I said quietly. It's expensive. He actually smiled a little at that. Like I'd surprised him. Then he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down carefully. No shouting. No panic. That calmness frightened me more than yelling would have. You were never supposed to find all this at once, he said. I stared at him. At once. He leaned back slightly. Claire. He paused, searching for the right tone. You never even noticed. The room went very still after that. Not because of the affair. Because suddenly, I understood the real insult. He believed that was true. I looked down at the remaining envelope beside my elbow. Cream-colored. Already opened once. Inside were loan authorization forms connected to my inheritance account. My signature sat crooked at the bottom. Except it wasn't mine. Not really. I recognized the date immediately. 3 days after my surgery last year. Pain medication, half conscious, barely getting out of bed. I looked up slowly. You forged this. Daniel's face changed then. Just slightly. Not guilt. Annoyance. It was temporary. My ears started ringing. You forged my name. You said you trusted me. I laughed once. Short, airless. He leaned forward suddenly. Do you want to blow up both our lives over paperwork? Paperwork. I looked at him sitting there in our kitchen beside the coffee maker. I bought the rent I paid the inheritance my grandmother left me after cleaning other people's houses most of her life. And something inside me went completely still. Not shattered. Worse. Finished. The first person I told was Denise from work. Not my mother. Not my friends. Denise. She was 58, divorced twice, wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and kept hard candy in her desk drawer, like somebody's aunt. I told her in the hospital parking garage during my lunch break, while freezing wind pushed wrappers across the concrete. She listened without interrupting. That mattered. Most people interrupt when they get uncomfortable. When I finished, Denise just leaned against her car and crossed her arms tighter. Do you have copies? She asked. I nodded. Good. That's it. What do you want me to say? I looked down at my coffee cup. I don't know. She was quiet a second. Then she said, You need a lawyer before you need a therapist. It was such a practical sentence I almost started crying right there. Instead I laughed. A bad laugh. Too sharp. Denise pretended not to notice. 3 days later, I met with an attorney in Oak Brook named Sandra Molina. Second floor office above a dentist. Brown carpet. Artificial plant near the window. Keurig machine humming in the lobby. Nothing dramatic. I appreciated that. Sandra wore navy scrubs under a long cardigan because she volunteered at legal clinics during the day sometimes. She flipped through the documents slowly while I sat across from her trying not to move too much. Every time I shifted in the chair, the fake leather squeaked. Finally, she took off her glasses. Did you authorize any of these transfers verbally? Number. Any emails? Number. Texts. I trusted my husband. She nodded once. Not pitying. Just writing something down. The forged signature matters, she said carefully. But proving intentional fraud inside a marriage can get messy. Messy. Everybody used that word once lawyers became involved. Like marriages were kitchen spills. Sandra tapped one of the mortgage statements lightly. You said the property's in Oak Park. Yes. And he's living there. I don't know. Do you want to know? I opened my mouth. Then closed it again. Because the answer was no. Not really. After the meeting, I sat in my car for almost 40 minutes watching people go in and out of the dentist downstairs. Normal lives. Normal problems. At some point my phone buzzed. Daniel. Where are you? No anger, no panic. Just that same steady tone. Like we were discussing groceries. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Then I drove back to work. That Friday, I moved into Denise's basement apartment temporarily. She called it an apartment. It was really a finished lower level, with a couch, tiny bathroom, and an old treadmill covered in folded laundry. Still, it was quiet. The first night there, Denise handed me a spare key attached to a faded gym membership tag. Stay as long as you need, she said. I nodded too fast because my throat suddenly hurt. She looked at me for another second. Then she said, There's leftover lasagna in the fridge. Don't thank me, just eat it. After she went upstairs, I sat alone on the pull-out couch, listening to footsteps overhead. I didn't realize how tense my body had become at home until then. Every sound used to mean something. A cabinet closing too hard. Silence upstairs. The way Daniel sighed before speaking. I'd been monitoring him for years without admitting it. The next week at work, people started acting strange around me. Not openly strange. Subtle. Conversations stopping when I walked into break rooms. Coworkers looking slightly too sympathetic. One afternoon, a woman from scheduling touched my arm and said, Marriage is hard. Just like that. I stared at her. What? Her face changed immediately. Oh, nothing. Daniel had started talking. Of course he had. Not cruelly. That would have been easier. Carefully. According to Jenna, who called me one night sounding uncomfortable, Daniel was worried about my stress levels. He said you've been overwhelmed for a while, she told me carefully. I sat on Denise's basement couch holding my phone away from my ear for a second. The dryer upstairs rumbled softly overhead. Did he mention the affair? Silence. Then, he said things got complicated. Complicated. I laughed quietly. Jenna lowered her voice. Claire, are you okay? I looked around the basement. Folded blankets, water heater humming, one sock sticking halfway out from under Denise's treadmill. I don't know yet, I said honestly. That weekend I drove past the Oak Park townhouse. I told myself I wouldn't. Then I did anyway. Small brick building, narrow steps, tiny winter wreath hanging on the front door. Completely ordinary. That hurt more somehow. Not glamorous. Not passionate. Just another life he'd been furnishing while I worked late. I stayed parked across the street for maybe 3 minutes. Then the front door opened. The woman in the green sweater stepped outside carrying grocery bags. Coral nails. Same careful movements. She looked tired. Not triumphant. Not seductive. Just tired. For one terrible second I saw myself in her. Then Daniel appeared behind her, holding his phone against his shoulder while locking the door. He laughed at something the person on the phone said. Easy laugh. The one people trusted. I drove away before either of them saw me. That night, Daniel called 3 times. I didn't answer. Then he texted, "Can we please talk like adults?" An hour later, "You're making this uglier than it needs to be." Then finally, "I never wanted to hurt you." I read that last message twice. Because I believed him. That was the problem. I believed he never wanted consequences. Hurting me had just become acceptable collateral. Monday morning, Sandra called while I was organizing patient files. "We found additional debt," she said. I closed the filing cabinet slowly. What kind of debt? A lot. Apparently Daniel had opened 2 credit lines connected to Greenbridge Holdings. One nearly maxed out. The townhouse wasn't fully paid for. Neither was half the furniture. I leaned against the cabinet hard enough to feel the metal edge through my sweater. Sandra kept talking. Legal terms, asset exposure, documentation. Then she paused. "There's something else." "What?" "He may have misrepresented income on the loan applications." I closed my eyes. Not because I was shocked anymore. Because suddenly I understood something simple and awful. The whole thing had been sinking long before I found it. Daniel wasn't living some secret perfect life. He was building another version of the same instability. Just with newer furniture. That night, another message came. Not from Daniel. From her. "Can we talk? I think he lied to both of us." I stared at the screen a long time before locking my phone again. Upstairs, Denise laughed at something on television. And for the first time in months, I realized I could sit still without waiting for someone else's mood to enter the room first. I met her at a coffee shop in Forest Park on a Tuesday afternoon. Middle of the day. Quiet enough that you could hear the espresso machine steaming milk every few minutes. She was already there when I arrived. Green sweater again. Or maybe a different one. Same color. She stood halfway when she saw me. "Claire." I nodded once and sat down across from her. Up close, she looked older than I first thought. Not by age, just tired around the eyes. There was a paper cup in front of her she hadn't touched. "I almost canceled," she said. I took my gloves off carefully. "Okay. I probably should have." Neither of us smiled. Outside, somebody walked past, pushing a stroller through dirty snow. She looked down at her hands. "My name's Natalie." "I know." That came out colder than I intended. She nodded like she deserved it. For a minute, neither of us spoke. Then she exhaled slowly. "He told me you were separated." I looked at her face while she said it. No performance. No fake innocence. Just embarrassment. "How long?" I asked. "A year." I stared at the window behind her. A year. That meant she'd been sitting at my dining table while I was still paying our electric bill. Natalie rubbed her thumb against the paper cup lid. "He said the marriage was over emotionally." I laughed quietly before I could stop myself. "That sounds like him." She looked up then. Not defensive, curious. Like she was hearing him differently now too. "He told me you didn't care anymore," she said carefully. I didn't answer. Because honestly, part of me understood how believable that probably sounded. Exhaustion looks a lot like indifference from the outside. Natalie swallowed. "I didn't know about the inheritance." I looked at her sharply. "I found out last week," she said quickly. "About the loans, the debt, everything." "Why are you telling me this?" She looked down again. "Because he asked me for money yesterday." That landed between us quietly. No dramatic pause. Just recognition. I leaned back in my chair slowly. "How much?" 10,000. I almost laughed again. Not because it was funny. Because it was so predictable suddenly. Natalie shook her head slightly. "He said the accounts were frozen temporarily, because you were trying to punish him." Punish him. I stared at the table. Then I asked the question I hadn't planned to ask. "Did you love him?" She took too long to answer. "Yes." I nodded once. I did too. That was probably the closest thing to kindness either of us could manage. After that, the conversation became strangely practical. Loan applications, dates, transfers. Natalie had copies of emails Daniel sent her about refinancing the townhouse. Some contradicted the financial statements he gave Sandra. When she forwarded them later that night, Sandra replied within 11 minutes. "This helps." No exclamation point. Just that. By February, Daniel stopped sounding confident on the phone. You could hear it happening gradually. The first few calls still carried that calm, reasonable tone. "Claire, this doesn't have to turn ugly." Then, "You're listening to people who don't understand our marriage." Then eventually, "You know me?" Like that alone should have fixed everything. During mediation prep, Sandra spread documents across a conference table while I drank terrible office coffee from a styrofoam cup. "He moved money constantly," she said. "Why?" "Probably to stay ahead of debt." She flipped another page toward me. "Honestly, I don't think he expected you to ever look closely." I stared at the paperwork. That sentence should have humiliated me. Instead, it made me tired. Sandra glanced at me. "You okay?" "Yeah." And weirdly, for once it was true. Not happy. Not healed. Just no longer drowning inside confusion. There's a difference. Meanwhile, people started treating Daniel differently. Not publicly. Nothing dramatic. Just small shifts. Rob stopped inviting him to poker nights. Jenna quit defending him in conversations. Mutual friends responded slower to his texts. The charm still worked at first. Then less. Then not much at all. Turns out, people forgive affairs faster than financial dishonesty. Especially when money starts touching everybody's sense of safety. One afternoon I ran into Daniel accidentally at Target. Household aisle. Of all places. He looked thinner. Not devastated. Just worn down around the edges. We stopped maybe 6 feet apart beside paper towels. Neither of us moved closer. "Hey," he said. "Hey." He glanced at my cart. Groceries, laundry detergent, cat food for Denise. Ordinary things. "You look good," he said. I almost told him I was sleeping again. Instead, I said nothing. He shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "I've been trying to call." "I know." He nodded slowly. There was music playing overhead, some soft pop song neither of us recognized. Finally, he said Natalie moved out. I looked at him. Not surprised. Just blank. She found out about the debt, he added. Again, I said nothing. Daniel shifted his weight slightly. I messed things up. That was the first honest sentence I'd heard from him in months. Maybe years. I studied his face while he stood there under fluorescent lights beside discounted storage bins. No grand collapse. No villain. Just a man who kept choosing short-term comfort until his life hollowed out around him. "I used to think you saw me as a failure," he said quietly. I frowned slightly. "What?" "When you came home from work." He looked away briefly. "You'd look so exhausted. I stopped feeling like your husband after a while." I leaned one hand against the shopping cart handle. "You could have told me that." "I know. But instead you stole from me." His jaw tightened immediately. "There it is." I stared at him. "There what is?" "You make everything sound ugly." For 1 second, old instincts flared up inside me. The urge to soften. To explain myself better. To make him comfortable enough to keep talking. Then it disappeared. Just like that. "I think it already was ugly," I said quietly. He looked at me for a long moment after that. Then he nodded once. Small. Defeated. Not dramatic. And suddenly I realized something strange. I wasn't afraid of his disappointment anymore. A month later, I reduced my second job hours for the first time in 4 years. The night I updated my availability schedule, my manager stared at me. "You sure?" Louise asked. "Yeah. You always take every shift." I looked down at the paper in my hand, then shrugged slightly. "I don't think I have to anymore." That night at the grocery store, I bought raspberries without checking the price first. Halfway through the checkout line, I noticed my shoulders weren't tense. I just stood there normally, like the world wasn't about to collapse because I relaxed for 1 second. And honestly, that scared me more than anything else had. The divorce finalized in April. Rain all morning. Thin gray rain that made the courthouse windows look dirty from the inside. Sandra met me near security, holding 2 coffees and a folder thick enough to hurt somebody with. "You eat anything?" she asked. I shook my head. She handed me a granola bar from her bag, without commenting further. People who've seen enough divorces stop expecting speeches from anyone. The hearing itself lasted less than 20 minutes. Years of marriage reduced to signatures and percentages. Daniel sat across the room in a navy button-down I bought him 3 birthdays ago. Still fit him. That bothered me more than it should have. He looked tired. Not dramatically ruined. Just older around the mouth somehow. At one point, the judge asked if both parties agreed to the terms. Daniel answered first. "Yes, Your Honor." Steady voice. Mine shook slightly when I said yes after him. Nobody reacted. Outside the courtroom, Sandra squeezed my shoulder once before leaving for another client. "Call me if he gets weird afterward." I almost smiled. Weird afterward sounded so small compared to what had already happened. Daniel waited until Sandra disappeared down the hallway before speaking. "Can we get coffee?" I looked toward the elevators. "I don't know if that's a good idea." "It's just coffee, Claire." That sentence used to work on me. Make me feel unreasonable for hesitating. Now it just sounded tired. Still, I said yes. Not because I missed him. Because I wanted one conversation where neither of us pretended anymore. We walked 2 blocks in silence to a diner near the train station. Red booths, scratched menus, a waitress refilling coffees without asking. The kind of place where people discuss custody arrangements and tax problems. Daniel sat across from me, turning his wedding ring around his finger, even though legally he didn't have to wear it anymore. I noticed that immediately. Old habits. The waitress came by. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee," I said. Daniel nodded. "Same." After she left, he looked out the window for a while. Cars moved slowly through rain outside. Finally, he said, "I kept thinking this would calm down eventually." I stirred cream into my coffee even though I usually drink it black. "What would you—" I looked up at him. There it was again. That instinct to frame everything as my reaction instead of his choices. Except now I could actually see it happening while he spoke. Daniel rubbed his forehead tiredly. "I'm not trying to fight." "Okay." "I mean it." I nodded once. For a minute, we just sat there listening to dishes clatter behind the counter. Then he sighed. "You want the truth?" I almost laughed. A little late for that. But I said sure. He looked down at his hands. When my freelance work dried up, I started feeling embarrassed all the time. I didn't interrupt. "At first you were supportive." I know. He swallowed. "But after a while, every time you came home exhausted, He shook his head slightly. I felt smaller. Outside, somebody crossed the street holding a newspaper over their head against the rain. Daniel watched them a second before continuing. "Natalie met me when I was consulting again, even though it wasn't making much money yet." "Okay." "She thought I was ambitious." I stared at him. "And I didn't." "You thought I needed help." I almost argued. Then stopped. Because maybe there was some truth buried inside that. Years of bills and schedules and exhaustion had turned both of us into roles instead of people. Still, that truth sat beside another truth. "You could have talked to me," I said quietly. "I know." "You could have left." "I know." "But instead, you used my inheritance to build another relationship." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they looked wet. Not crying. Just tired. "I kept thinking I could fix it before you found out." "That doesn't even make sense." It did to me. The waitress refilled our coffees silently. Neither of us touched them afterward. Daniel looked older sitting there than he had during the marriage. Like maintaining all those versions of himself had finally exhausted him too. "I did love you," he said quietly. I believed him. That was the hardest part in the end. Not that he hated me. That he loved me and still did it anyway. Love turns out to be a weak protection against selfishness sometimes. I looked down at the sugar packets near my hand. "You know what the worst part was?" He waited. "You watched me work myself sick." His face tightened immediately. I continued before he could interrupt. I kept thinking we were surviving something together. The diner went quiet around us for a second. Or maybe I just stopped hearing it. Daniel stared at the table. Then nodded once. Small. I know. No defense this time. No correction. Just that. When we left, the rain had mostly stopped. We stood outside awkwardly beside the parking meters. Two people who used to share a bed now discussing umbrellas and train schedules. Daniel shoved his hands into his coat pockets. I hope you're okay, he said. And for once it sounded real. Not manipulative. Not strategic. Just sad. I think I will be, I answered. He nodded. Then he walked toward the station without looking back. I watched him disappear into the crowd for a second, before turning the other direction. A month later, I moved into a smaller apartment closer to the hospital. 3rd floor, bad water pressure, tiny kitchen. Mine. The first night there, I unpacked dishes while sitting cross-legged on the floor because I still hadn't bought a table. At the bottom of an old purse, I found a crumpled yellow sticky note. Don't forget oat milk. I stared at it a long time. Then I threw it away without reading it again. That felt important somehow. Not anger. Not closure. Just enough. These days, my life is quieter. I work less. I sleep more. Sometimes I still catch myself apologizing when I don't need to. Still catch myself explaining things nobody questioned. But not as often. And honestly, if you're listening to this while constantly shrinking yourself to keep somebody else comfortable, pay attention to that. The small things matter. The exhaustion. The way you brace before walking into your own home. The way you stop checking your own instincts because someone keeps correcting them. Nothing breaks all at once. Usually it happens slowly. And quietly. Until one day you realize you can breathe again. The end.